welcome to our program this evening. My name is Vicki Prophet. I'm the Vice President of the Perinton Historical Society, and on their behalf, we'd like to welcome you to this evening's very special cemetery tour program. Before we get started, we have a few brief announcements. I noticed that we were out of membership forms, so I'm very happy to have people picking those up. The Perinton Historical Society owns and operates the Fairport Museum, and we're able to do that thanks to membership dues, bequests, donations, gift shop sales. So it is very important for us to keep that membership up, and we welcome you to our membership. We have a lot of fun around here, so we hope you'll join us. We always have volunteer opportunities as well. The museum's open 9 hours a week. We have volunteers that work 1 2 to 3 hour shift a month, so it's not a big constraint on your time. We would love to welcome you as a museum volunteer as well. So if you're interested in that, please see me after the program. We have a full house this evening, so we'll just take care of fire exit issues right now. One out the back door and to the left, one up the stairs from whence you came, and another one out in the hallway that will lead you out to the side of the building. We've got a few exciting summer programs coming up. In July 10th, we will have 500 cyclists coming to the Fairport area. They will be staying overnight at Minerva DeLand, and we will also have the museum open from 4 to 8 that day for an open house. So if you want to come see cyclists, this is the time to do it. Maybe that was on your bucket list, I don't know, but,
Motorcyclists?
It is bicycles.
Vicki,
Yes.
Vicki, Charles is trying to put the clip on.
We also have a very special event called Votilla. Has anyone heard of Votilla yet? Excellent. We're very excited about that. Votilla is an event which is commemorating the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage in New York State and the 200th anniversary of the beginning of canal construction. The Votilla is a series of about 5 boats, as far as we know, that will start off in Seneca Falls and wind their way through until they get to Cobb's Hill Landing. And on Wednesday, July 19th, they're coming to Fairport. So they're due to arrive about 4:30. The Fairport Historical Club will be holding a debate on women's suffrage that actually took place in 1914. 1914, there were women for and against women's suffrage at that point. So that is certain to be a very exciting event. 7 o'clock at the Fairport Library, author Jean Garrett will be portraying Susan B. Anthony, and she does a wonderful job. We've had her here before, so you should check her out at the library. And we've also got an open house right here at the museum from 7 to 9 that evening to welcome the boaters and anyone else who would like to join us. Now, every year for the past 6 years, we have had cemetery tours in which we portray the eternal residents of the burying grounds of Fairport. This is the first year we have done St. Mary's, so we're very excited about that. If you're not familiar with where St. Mary's is, it's located on Turk Hill Road, right next to the Perinton Rec Center. If you drive too fast, you can't see the sign, so it's set far back on the road, but it is a wonderful place, and if you were able to attend our house tour last year, it focused on the immigrants from the north side of town, many of whom are buried at St. Mary's, and some of which you will hear from this evening. The cemetery opened in 1872 and is the final resting place for many Irish and Italian immigrants. It is still an active cemetery, and it is operated by the Church of the Assumption. And we are so fortunate to have had the assistance from Church of the Assumption for Mike Mason and Maura Walsh, who have helped us to spread the word about this program and to also help us locate graves, because that's sort of helpful when we put this program together as well. So I hope you will enjoy the performances tonight. I've got to say, it was so difficult. We were sort of short of actors this year, so we have 9 performances. 2 Irish, and the rest are Italian. So my apologies to our Irish community. There were very many interesting Irish people, but it just sort of happened that we went the Italian route. But all of them had something, a really interesting story to share. And at the end of the program, we're going to have a list of many of the Italians that came to this area starting in the early 1900s. And I'll be very interested to see how many of you are family members of those people. So please enjoy the performances from our Illuminated History actors.
How many inns and hotels are there in the village of Fairport today? Anyone? Now, one just recently opened the inn on Church, but before that there hadn't been a hotel in the village for some time. I, William J. Carey, and my brother Edward both ran hotels in the village. And there were many other hotels besides. I ran the Fairport Hotel, which was originally called Mallett's Tavern. It's right along the canal. It's look a fair bit different in the old days than it does now, as you can see by these pictures. In the old days, people traveled by canal and later by railroad and needed overnight lodging, by the way. Business was brisk. Our dining room and bar also served the locals, of course. Men and women would stop by for a drink or a friendly game of cards. Mallett's Tavern, as it originally was known, was Fairport's very first tavern. Legend says that it was even the name, legend says it was even where the name of our village was coined, when someone called it a fine, fair port. The original structure was built in just 3 days in 1825. Mr. Mallett supplied all of his friends with food and drink while they completed the task. Buildings were a lot less complicated in those days. There was no heating or electricity or plumbing. The biggest challenge was making sure that your friend could still see straight enough to make the walls straight. I ran the Fairport Hotel in the early 20th century. It had already been remodeled before I bought it. Heat had been added in the late 1800s. I remodeled it again and added a 3rd floor, changing the roof line to a flat one with bracketing. I also added many balconies for the guests to get some fresh air and enjoy the village's comings and goings. My wife Margaret helped me run our establishment. Our only son William was born there. Mallett's Tavern was the only hotel in town for the time it was built in 1825 to the 1860s, when the Osborne Hotel was built. My older brother Edward owned and ran that hotel from the late 1800s until the early 1900s. My brother Edward was quite a successful fellow. We were sons of Irish immigrants and our parents had very little. Our father was a shoemaker and we went to school through the 8th grade and then we had to get to work. Edward held a variety of jobs, gaining valuable business experience along the way. He worked at a grocery store for a few years, then DeLand Chemical. After that, he manufactured and sold cigars and confections. He ran that business very successfully for 2 years, but had a disastrous fire and lost everything. He decided to start over at something completely different, and he rented the Osborne Hotel beginning in 1888. He was so successful running it that he ended up buying it soon after. The Osborne House was situated on North Main Street, just where Thomas Creek crosses, halfway between the railroad tracks and High Street today. Sadly, the building is no longer there, but is located where Mac's Philly cheesesteak is today. Back in our day, there was another set of railroad tracks that crossed Main Street just by George Taylor's building on the corner of High Street. The Osborne was situated between 2 sets of tracks. securing a great location for itself to serve those traveling by train. The Osborne operated as a hotel for over 70 years. The dining room held 50 people and was a popular place for Sunday dinner. It was a 3-story building with 10 guest rooms on the top 2 floors. The first floor had a parlor, a bar, and a dining room, as the office and the kitchen. There was also an ice house out back which stored the ice that had been cut from Thomas Creek and the oxbow on the canal. Back then there was also livery stables where people could rent horses and buggies. This was very popular with traveling salesmen who came into town on the train and needed to see their customers. The livery stable also housed a hearse for Henry Relay and the undertaker. For a time it was a grand hotel, to be sure. Edward had such great success at the Osborne Hotel that he bought the Fairport as well. Edward's first wife, Margaret, died very young. He subsequently married Margaret's sister, Catherine. He had 2 sons, Edward and Arthur, who were born at the Osborne Hotel, just as my son had been born at the Fairport Hotel. By 1907, Edward had tired of the hotel business. He sold the Osborne Hotel, and he sold the Fairport Hotel to me. He went into the produce business. He bought the Deland House in its 12-acre park at the corner of Main Street and Whitney Roads, and turned the park into housing lots for development. He saw the opportunity to develop the north part of the village, as it was expanding rapidly at the time, with the influx of immigrants moving into that part of town. Edward was also active in politics at both the local and state levels. His other passion was horses. He was obsessed with them. So he began breeding racehorses. Here's a picture of him in front of his hotel. For all the success and happiness, though, my family members weren't destined to live very long. My parents both died relatively young. Edward, our sister Nellie, and I all died within 2 years of each other around the time of World War I. I died first in 1916 of stomach hemorrhage at the age of 47. My brother Edward moved back to the Fairport Hotel to help my wife Margaret keep it going. It got harder to make a go of it because that year Perinton voted to become a dry town. All the saloons and hotels had to figure out how to stay in business. Edward and Margaret served soft drinks in the bar and tried to boost the boarding and dining room business. Edward died a year later after me, also of stomach cancer. Our sister died a year after him in 1918. After my death, my wife ran a boarding house in Fairport for a few years and moved into Rochester. But before she moved, she did her civic duty in the election of 1917 on whether to pave the village roads. Margaret was the first person in town to cast her ballot. And the resolution passed silently by a margin of 12-1. Main and church streets were paved that year. I don't know what Edward's horses would have thought about it, to be sure, but it would have been a lot less mud in the hotel, and I would wish I would have lived to see that. Edward's son Arthur also helped run both hotels for years, and then went on to work in the town. By 1929, he became the street commissioner, and remained so until his death in 1951 at age 54. He was a member of the fire department for 30 years and member of the Board of Elections for 9. Some of our descendants continue the family tradition of hospitality, operating the Sugar Bowl for a while. I like to think of that as the Carey's family hospitality helped Fairport grow into a thriving, welcoming place that it is today, and I'm glad that there's once again an inn operating in the village for lodgers to spend the night in our Fairport.
Ciao. I am Antonietta Marinelli Galante. I was born in Castel Bordino, Italy in 1912, which is located in central Italy, 6 miles from the Adriatic Sea in the Abruzzo region. My husband, Nicola Galante, and I lived in a big house with our parents, our 4 children, my brother and sister-in-law, and their 3 children. It was a busy place. My husband Nikola was a farmer. Our lives revolved around the planting seasons. In March, we planted the tobacco seed in wooden flats. In June, the big leaves of the tobacco plant were harvested by the children and carried under the shade of the big oak tree where the leaves were threaded on an 8-inch long needle and left to dry in the sun. In fall, Nikola would lay the dried tobacco leaves in a box lined with burlap and make bales of the burlap boxes. When all the tobacco was baled, Nikola rented a truck and drove to the city of Lanciano and sold the bales. That money helped to provide clothes for our children. We had many animals on the farm: cows, sheep, dog, cat. We hatched baby chicks and raised sheep for wool. Father was in charge of the sheep. Because he was old and crippled and he could not run after the sheep, my son Giuseppe would help him. We called Giuseppe Il Pecoraro, the sheep boy. In the warm weather, they let the sheep out to graze early in the morning. They brought the sheep into the barn before noon and let them out again before sunset to graze until dark. In May, the sheep were sheared, and Nikola took the bundles of wool to the wool factory, where he traded it for yarn. There were no horses on the farm. Instead, we had oxen to pull the plow and the wagon. All of us, even the children, went to the fields in June and cut down the hay with sickles. We cut a handful of grain and then divided it in half and tied the ends together to make binding. We laid the binding on the ground and piled the wheat on top of it. Then we tied it together in a bundle. At the end of the day, we piled all the bundles up in the field where they stayed for several weeks. At 9:30, we would stop for breakfast. We had bread, cheese, and wine. Even the children. At 1 p.m., we stopped for lunch. We had homemade macaroni and chicken or fried cheese balls made with grated cheese, eggs, and breadcrumbs. We had wine to drink again. We were very happy. After lunch, we all managed to get back to work. In the middle of the afternoon, when we began to feel sleepy, we would sing to keep ourselves awake. If it was too hot to work, we would take a nap and then go back to work when it cooled off. We worked until sunset, and then we all went home for supper. We had a light meal of fried fish or dried sausage with bread and salad. In August, Nikola would rent the threshing machine and would ask friends, relatives, and neighbors to come and help with the threshing. As the grain poured out of the threshing machine, 2 men would catch it in a burlap bag. When the bag was half full, they would carry it into the storeroom and dump it in one corner, which was walled off for grain. We stored beans, olive oil, and corn there. The men worked all day at the threshing. The women did the cooking. Every month, Nikola would take 5 or 6 sacks of grain to the mill to be ground into flour that we used to make macaroni and bread. When half of the pile was threshed, the men stopped to eat. The women served a lunch of green beans, cheese, bread, and of course, wine. During the afternoon, the children served wine, water, and cookies. When the threshing was finished, the men washed up and put on clean shirts, and we served them a big dinner of macaroni, duck, chicken, and, you guessed it, wine. I see a pattern here. In mid-September, when the grapes were ripe, we made wine. We went into the vineyards and cut the grapes with scissors and put them into big baskets. When the baskets were full, we emptied them into barrels. When we'd finished, my husband would come with the oxen and wagon and carry the barrels of grapes to the barn. In the evening, we would help my father crush the grapes. Nikola would fill a burlap bag with grapes and place it in a wooden box which was raised up on 2 sawhorses. Then he would stomp on the grapes until all the juice had run out. The juice ran through a hole at the lower end of the box into a bucket. When the buckets filled up, we emptied them into a big barrel. In a month or 2, the juice would have fermented into wine, which we would drink all year long. In November, we picked the olive crop. The trees were so big we had to use ladders to reach the olives. We tied burlap bags around our waists because it made picking easier. The trees were so big that 5 or 6 of us would be picking at the same tree. We would laugh and sing as we worked to make our days shorter. At the end of the day, Nicola loaded up the bags of olives onto the wagon and took them to town to be pressed into olive oil. I used the oil for cooking and the strong oil and fat to make soap. In the wintertime, we wove cloth. We had a large loom 10 feet long in a separate room. At first, my father grew the flax for the linen thread we wove into the cloth. Later, we bought cotton thread. We used the cloth for sheets, pillowcases, bedspreads, and tablecloths. On a smaller loom, we wove narrow strips of cloth for dish towels and napkins. We used colored thread to make stripes in the dish towels. Life in Italy was good, but it was a hard life. Nicola wanted to come to the United States in order to make a better life for our family. We had many discussions and many tears were shed when we decided that Nicola should go to America, leaving me and the children behind. By that time, our eldest, Michele, was 21. The twins, Honorina and Maria, were 18, and our baby, Giuseppe, was 16. We said goodbye to my husband as he started on his adventure. On January 11th, 1955, he arrived in the United States on a ship called the Saturnia. His brother Giulio, now called Julius, came to New York City to pick him up at the boat. Julius had immigrated to a pretty village in New York called Fairport several years earlier. That is where Nicola wanted to be as well. Julius met Nicola at Ellis Island at Gate G for Galante, and they drove to Fairport. It was a great joy for both brothers to see each other after so many years. Nicola was also glad to see his two other brothers, Tony, formerly Antonio, and Joe, formerly Giuseppe, who were living in East Rochester. At first, he lived with Tony. Their sister Philomena lived in Lockport, so she was close enough to visit. Nicola was lucky there was a lot of Italian people in Fairport to help him get used to his new country. It took 3 years before Nicola could send for us. Our youngest child, Giuseppe, and I set sail in 1958 on the Giulio Cesare, bound for New York City. We were in awe as we approached New York, seeing the Statue of Liberty and the New York skyline for the very first time. After we docked, we got our suitcases and walked down the gangplank onto U.S. soil at Ellis Island. What a wonderful reunion we had with my husband and his family. We drove to Fairport and lived in a little house at 45 Frank Street in Fairport Village, right next to my brother-in-law, Julius. Later, we moved to 27 Frank Street. Giuseppe got a job at the paper mill in East Rochester. After 3 years, the paper mill burned down, so then he got a job at a grocery store called Food Town as a butcher. Nicola worked for American Can on Parse Avenue. It was so easy for him to walk to work. Our only sadness was leaving our twin daughters, Honorina and Maria, and our eldest son, Michele, back in Italy. In November 1960, we were notified by the immigration office that President Kennedy wanted immigrant families reunited, so there was a chance that our family might soon be reunited. In January 1961, our remaining children set sail on the Leonardo da Vinci out of Naples. The journey took 7 days. My husband's son and brother-in-law, Julius, greeted them at Ellis Island and drove them back to Fairport, where I was waiting with open arms. It was a great joy to have our family together again after 7 long years of separation. Nicola loved taking the family to visit friends and relatives. "Now you can meet my whole family," he would say, beaming with pride. Then he would introduce us one by one. The happiness didn't last long, though. 1 year and 7 months after our remaining children arrived in the U.S., my husband became sick with cancer. Nicola lived to see our eldest son married in June 1962. 3 months later, he died. Living without him was difficult, but our children married one by one and gave us grandchildren, for which I was extremely grateful. I died in 1998, 36 years after my husband, and was buried beside him at St. Mary's Cemetery, where I watch over my descendants today.
Buonasera. I am Maddalena Carlo Musto, and since I am from Italy, I greeted you in Italian. I started out this life in Ponte Corvo, a small village about halfway between Rome and Naples in western Italy. My husband, Antonio, was from the same area. We moved to the United States in the early 1900s, living in California for a while, before settling in Fairport in 1910. We opened a shoe and leather store on the corner of North Main Street and High Street, where we remained the rest of our lives. We rented space from Mr. Ryan, and Antonio made and repaired leather harnesses and all kinds of leather goods as well as shoes. But in the 19-teens, horses were on their way out, and cars were coming in. By 1915, we decided groceries might be a more profitable business, and we opened a grocery store. Over the next few years, we sold off our entire shoe and harness stock and then expanded to add a butcher's counter. Business was brisk, and we expanded several times after that, adding to our offerings. Eventually, we bought the building from Mr. Ryan, and it was known as the Calamusto block for many years. Oops. In addition to helping with the store, which was a family affair, I raised 4 daughters, Anna, Lucy, Margaret, and Ida, all born in Fairport. Every Sunday, our family walked to church at the Assumption of Our Lady, and all of the girls went to school. In fact, 2 of them went to college. I was active at church, helping with the guilds and other projects. Mostly recent immigrants lived at our end of town, and many of our neighbors were Italian like us. If you came into the store, it sounded like the old country, most of the time because everyone was speaking Italian. It was comforting to hear, and much easier than conversing in English for me. We Italians stuck together. Antonio was a founding member of the San Sebastian Society, a mutual aid society for Italian immigrants. The group started in 1915, and members paid dues. We also raised money by holding dance at the Osborne Hotel, Mr. Carey's fine establishment, as well as pig roasts and other social events. Socializing was one of the things that our group did best, helping the younger ones retain some of their Italian heritage while they were growing up American. The San Sebastian Society also provided food and shelter for those in need, especially recent immigrants, and dental care and medical care for its members. My Antonio was a savvy businessman. In addition to our store, he had other ventures. As well, he bought some land on Elm Street in 1915 and developed 11 houses there. In the 1920s, he ran the Fairport Chevrolet dealership next to our store. He was very hardworking and quite an entrepreneur. He had a lot of, how should I put it? My Anthony was feisty. There's just no other way to describe him. He worked hard, and he fought for everything we ever had. Nobody handed us anything. As immigrants, many people looked down on us, and we had to grasp and struggle for everything at first. But we worked hard, and it paid off. There were setbacks for sure, but overall we did all right. There are a few events that stand out in my mind as tough times, though. First, in 1916, Perinton voted to become a dry town, as Mr. Carey mentioned. Antonio was arrested in 1917, supposedly for selling liquor in our store. He was eventually cleared of the charge by a jury, but not before being hauled off by the police and having to post $500 in bail. That was a wild time. Also, over the years, we experienced not 1, but 3 fires. Fires were not uncommon, as Mr. Carey mentioned, but I don't know that anyone else in the village was beset by flames as much as we were. Our first fire was in 1917 when Mr. Ryan owned the building and lived on the second floor. We lived on the third floor, and our store, as well as others, were on the street level. During the night, we were awakened to flames and smoke. The cause was not definitively determined, but seemed to come from either a stovepipe or a cigar left smoldering from the election board meeting held in Mr. Ryan's apartment earlier in the evening. Luckily, no one was injured, but we lost so much of our clothing and furniture, say nothing for the stock in the store. We did have some insurance, thank God, but it was a terrible, scary time. It was also a lot of work to clean up. Then, in the influenza epidemic in 1918, I lost my darling baby girl, Ada. It was a very difficult 3 years. In December of 1932, just before Christmas, we had another fire. By this time, we owned the building, and there were 10 of us living in the floors above the store. Smoke woke up one of the grandbabies at about 4 o'clock in the morning. Antonio ran to the firebox in his underwear to call the fire department. There was a lot of smoke, but no flames. The firemen thought they had it out and left, only to be called back several times the next day. Smoke kept starting up again, and although we couldn't tell exactly where it was coming from, no flames were seen. Finally, to be sure they had all the flames out, they had to chop holes in the roof and the walls. Between that and the smoke and water damage, our building was a mess. We had to live with family and friends while we rebuilt. But we reopened the store 2 weeks later, in early January, only to have another fire in February, this time in the chimney. All of this was so disheartening, but not nearly so disheartening as having the Rochester newspaper accuse my husband of arson. Of all the nerve, my Antonio would never start those fires, nor would he have risked our lives and those of our children and grandchildren for some insurance money. It was ridiculous. However, the Fairport paper defended us in print, which took some of the sting out of the situation. At least our town and our own fire department, and who ought to know but them, they put the fire out, stood by us publicly and refuted these ridiculous charges. However, there were plenty of good times as well. We were involved in the community in addition to our church and the San Sebastian Society. Antonio, or Tony as most people called him, was part of the Fairport Businessmen's Group. As a merchant and businessman, he wanted the town to thrive and grow, and he did his part. He also wanted to make it a great place to live. In 1922, when the new library was being built on Perinton Street, where we are gathered right here now, Antonio helped canvass the town to raise money for new books, to help make our library the modern, well-furnished establishment that Fairport deserved. By the 1950s, we were growing weary of the long hours the store required. Our daughter, Anna, and her husband, Thomas Biacucci, had been helping us run the store for many years, and we decided to turn it over to them completely. We lived out our golden years, enjoying our family, this wonderful village we called home, and our beloved cottage on Canandaigua Lake. There I enjoyed the sun and the water and keeping a watchful eye over my darling grandchildren while they swam. Antonio died in 1969, and I followed him in 1973. We were buried in St. Mary's from our beloved Church of the Assumption of Our Lady, our parish for over 60 years. Anna and Thomas ran the store well into the 1970s until the big chain grocery stores like Tops came in, making it hard for the mom and pop stores to survive. At one time, we had a dozen little markets in the village, like Messerino's, Principali's, and ours, and we were all making a living selling groceries, meat, and produce. But later, people preferred the bigger shops. I have fond memories of the store. I raised my daughters there, and Anna raised her 4 children there, taking care of them in the room behind the delicatessen counter, just as I did. Families lived, worked, and worshiped together when I was alive. We knew all our customers by name. We also knew their preferences and their business. It's a bygone era, to be sure, but a happy one for me. Not going to get it off. Stuck him out.
Put it on, because I don't know what to put it on. I don't have any pockets, unfortunately. Buongiorno! Hello, my friends. My name is Benedetto Ansuini. I came to Fairport from Italy when I was a young man. Although I only had a second-grade education, I was fortunate to get a job in the Certo factory here in the village. People called me a hero. I'm no hero. I was just doing my job as a soldier. You see, when the Great War began, I left my new home to fight for the United States. I was with a Company K of the 307th Infantry, 77th American Division. Our group became known as the Lost Battalion. But that was just a phrase coined by a sharpshooter reporter. First of all, we knew where we were all the time. We didn't get lost. Second, we weren't a battalion, we were 2. So here's what really happened. After 7 days of continuous fighting in the Meuse-Argonne offensive in the Argonne forest, about 600 of us were cut off behind enemy lines. On October 2, 1918, we'd advanced into the forest under the belief that French forces were supporting our left flank and American units were supporting the right. We moved beyond the rest of the Allied forces, not knowing that the French advance had been stalled and found ourselves cut off from the Allied line, cut off from the Allies and surrounded by German forces. After locating a good defensive position, we started digging in an area which became known as the Pocket. On October 3, the Germans attacked us with trench mortars, machine guns, fire, grenades. Sniper fire was ringing out all around us. They even had a flamethrower, decimating our ranks like a cookout on the 4th of July. We suffered many hardships as our food supply was low, fresh water was difficult to procure, and ammunition was in short supply. At times, we were even bombarded with shells from our own artillery. It was hell on earth. To make matters worse, every runner we sent to get help got lost or ran into German patrols and were either killed or captured. The only way we could communicate with headquarters was by carrier pigeon. However, each of the pigeons we sent out was shot down. Finally, we were down to one final pigeon. The pigeon's name was Cher Ami, which in French means dear friend. He was dispatched with a canister on his right leg with a message from our commanding officer, Major Charles Whittlesey. The message read, Our artillery is dropping a barrage directly on us. For heaven's sake, stop it. But right after releasing Cher Ami, a shell exploded below the bird, killing 5 men and stunning the pigeon. But despite being shot in the breast, blinded in one eye, and losing a foot, Cher Ami got through the lines. Flew 25 miles to headquarters in 25 minutes and delivered Major Whittlesey's message. It took several more days before we were saved. From October 2nd through October 8th, the Germans continued a relentless attack against us. The attack wasn't only physical, but it was mental. A demand to surrender was received. It said, "The suffering of your wounded men can be heard over here in the German lines, and we are appealing to your humane sentiments to stop." You see, they wanted Major Whittlesey to give up, but he knew how important it was to the war effort to forge ahead. Reporters, again, say the Major's response to the Germans was, "Go to hell." But that was just to sell the newspapers. Actually, he didn't send a response. He didn't feel it was needed. We had a job to do, and we were damn well going to do it. All of us knew it. Well, relief finally arrived at 1500 hours on October 8th when the Allied reinforcements broke through the line. They arrived in the nick of time. We went in as a force of 600 men, but only 194 came out unscathed. The rest were either captured, missing, wounded, or dead. Among the dead were 3 out of the 8 men in the group from Rochester. Homer Rayson was from Pittsford, and he survived. But he died a hero 10 days later after trying to obtain water for his regiment from a spring that was under heavy machine gun fire. In fact, the guys from Pittsford named their American Legion post the Rayson-Miller Post, in part after Homer Rayson. I continued serving with the military until May of 1919 when I was honorably discharged. Life pretty much went on as if the war never happened. I came back to Fairport, married my sweetheart, Conchita Ronaldo, and went back to work at the Serto plant. Another highlight in my life, Conchita and I had 2 sons, both of whom were born in Fairport, Louis in 1921 and Salvatore in 1924. Salvatore, who liked to be called Sam, was an all-star athlete and graduated from Fairport in 1942. I just happen to have with me the 1942 Fairport High School hourglass. And if any of you would like to see a picture of my son Sam, it's on page 29, Salvatore and Suni. And I want to share something with you about him. I see Coach Logan here. This is pretty good. What do you think about this, Coach? Football, 1, 2, 3, 4. Captain, 4. All county, 4. Band, 1, 2, 3, 4. Alpha Beta Phi, stunt night. Students Association representative. He was a fine young man. Both of my boys were fine young men. And both boys served during World War II. I'm proud of both my boys. They married and gave me wonderful grandchildren. Another highlight in my life came in 1942 when I was brought to New York City and honored for working for 25 years for Serto. I was awarded a gold lapel emblem, a $100 defense bond, and an extra week's paid vacation. Although that was an honor to be there with other men who had worked for Serto for so long and to be recognized for it. But by far, the best part of the trip was when I was asked to speak about my experience with the Lost Battalion in a radio broadcast to a nationwide audience. That was really something. I lived a good life. A beautiful family and a nice home I owned at 72 East Avenue in Village. I had a steady job in the community I'd grown to love. In January 1971, I took my final breath at age 77. Following a funeral mass at the Church of the Assumption, I was laid to rest here at St. Mary's Cemetery. So, as I said before, I was no hero. You want heroes? Talk about Major Whittlesey, or Homer Rayson, or the brave little pigeon, Cher Ami. I was just an ordinary guy who helped out in an extraordinary time. Thanks for listening to my story. You have to do it. I don't know how to do that.
Okay.
You got it?
Yep.
If you lived on the north side of town in my day, you were likely either Irish or Italian. My family, the Principales, were Italian. My name is Thomasina, although I went by Thelma here in America. That may not sound very Italian, but my husband's name was Tony, which, as you'll hear throughout the night, was almost a requirement to live in this part of town. We were both born in Campobello di Mazzara, Italy, which is in the very toe of the boot, and our 3 oldest children were born there, Peter, John, and Dominic. We immigrated to America in 1902, and our 3 daughters, Laura, Catherine, and Fanny, were all born here in New York. We lived on John Street, which some of you may know became State Street, which is now Liftbridge Lane East, and we stayed there our whole lives here in America. Many of our neighbors worked either at the can company, owned a hotel, or ran a grocery store, and the Principales did all of the above at one point or another. My husband Tony worked at the can company for many years, which you'll hear about later from our dear neighbor, Mrs. Messerino. It was good, steady work, and our children were all able to go to school here and get a good education. Some of them went to work at the can company when they left school at age 14. They all learned English and were very American. I did not learn too much English myself, but I was able to get by just fine because many of our neighbors were Italian and the shopkeepers also spoke Italian. Life was very good to us the first decade or so we were here, but then the Great War broke out. At first, it seemed a world away, and other than providing lots of work at the can company, it didn't affect us too much. But as the United States got dragged in, I began to fear for my 3 sons, who were all of an age to serve. As it was, only our middle son, John, served. He was a very talented musician. He played the clarinet, and he joined the 2nd U.S. Cavalry Band. He went to basic training and then headed over to Europe. The local paper, the Fairport Herald, ran a section every week called Letters from Our Boys, and I'd like to read you an excerpt of one letter that they published written by my son John in 1918. Dear Sir, today I received for the first time since in France, by forwarded mail, your paper dated March 20th. Of course, the paper was several months old by the time I got it, but I was still very much excited to have it just the same. It was good to see pictures and read letters from other Fairport boys. I deeply regret to learn that John Howell was the first Fairport boy to make the supreme sacrifice in war. Regarding my trip across, I won't go into full details, but it happened that Francis McCarthy of Fairport was a first-class seaman on our Navy transport ship, and I was very glad to see him, of course. In the evenings, we would go up on deck and talk about home. One evening, we talked so much about Fairport, I almost forgot that I was on the way to the trenches. About the 3rd day out to sea, I became seasick, and McCarthy came down below deck to look for me. He visited me daily, and he would often have a bottle of juice or some cake or something good to eat. One evening, I was feeling seasick, but he told me it was all in my imagination, and he went on telling jokes and funny stories and talking about Fairport, and in no time, I forgot I was seasick. Many a time, he made me feel proud of him and of Fairport, too. Our band plays daily concerts, and to have so much music and so much good weather here in France makes me feel as if victory is near. With best regards, I remain musician John Principales, 2nd U.S. Cavalry Band. Almost 100 Fairport boys served our country in the Great War, including Benedetto, my son John, and Francis McCarthy that you heard about in the letter. There was hardly a family who didn't have somebody over there fighting for democracy and the American way of life we had become so accustomed to. After the war, our sons began a new endeavor. They started a grocery and meat market together in the Deal Block at 32 North Main Street near Barranco's, who you'll hear from later. Business was so good that after just a few short years, they were able to buy the building across the street, renovate it, and open an expanded store, adding dry goods and men's furnishings. My son Dominic and his sister Fanny ran the new part of the store. Nick Messerino even worked for us for a while as well. Our success in the store was based on treating both our customers and our employees well. We prided ourselves on prompt and courteous service, and my husband even left the can company to work there. My son John became a salesman at a furniture company in Rochester and moved into the city in 1930, but retained some ownership in the store. Dominic and Fanny continued to run it, and my son Peter and his wife Lucy bought the Cottage Hotel. Can you show me? There we go, Cottage Hotel, which was on the corner of State Street and Main Street, right near our house. They ran it for over 28 years, and then their sons ran it for several years after that. The hotel had been built in 1887 by Peter Daly, and it was another grand, beautiful hotel in the village. Much like the Osborne, it had guest rooms, dining facilities, a bar, and a livery stable, and it served travelers from both the canal and the trains, as well as many locals. It was a huge Queen Anne-style building with a 4-story tower, and the rooms were heated by steam from the very beginning, and later had running water and electricity. Over time, several additions were made, and eventually, as you can see out the back, there were over 35 guest rooms, as well as a public reading room available. As you heard from Mr. Carey earlier, operating a hotel in town had its ups and its downs, and Prohibition brought certain challenges. Before my son bought the hotel in 1933, Prohibition was in full swing. And the newspapers were always full of stories of G-men raiding in places like Chicago and New York City. But they had work to do right here in Fairport as well. In 1922, the Cottage Hotel was raided. The manager, Mr. Connolly, fled the sheriffs and led them on a wild chase all the way into Rochester, and then he fled on foot even more, and it took them a long time to apprehend him, but they eventually did. The hotel was even shut down for a while, but it eventually reopened. Al Capone had nothing on us. By the time my son Peter and his wife Lucy bought the hotel, Prohibition was over, and the bar was once again a gathering place for locals, as you can see from this picture. Many of the American Can Company workers would stop by after their shift on their way home for a drink at the bar. The north part of Main Street had so many bars and taverns, it was nicknamed Whiskey Flats. Peter and Lucy renovated the hotel a bit on their own as well. One of their improvements was to turn the billiard room on the first floor into a second dining room with room for an orchestra platform and a floor show area. They installed an amplification system to carry the live orchestra music both to the main dining room and to the dance hall on the second floor. It was a very popular place to spend a pleasant evening and was popular for special events. Many local families rented out the Cottage Hotel for weddings, including Mrs. Messerino's daughter, Margaret. Running a hotel is a 24/7 job requiring long hours and many hands to make a go of it. There's some advantages to having a hotel in the family, though, including you have a ready-made place to have family parties. We celebrated birthdays, anniversaries, and Christmases there, sometimes having upwards of 50 people. That would have been a lot of people to cook for in my kitchen, even for an Italian mom. My children even surprised my husband and I with a 50th wedding anniversary party there in 1939. All of our children and grandchildren were there, and it was a very special day. World War II came, and it brought prosperity after the Depression, but it also brought challenges. Like many of our neighbors, we had family members who served overseas. Our son John, who had served so nobly in the war to end all wars, had to send his son Anthony back to Europe in the Second World War. Sadly, he died in France in 1942. When the war was over, my son requested that the U.S. government return his body to U.S. soil, which they did, and he was laid to rest in Holy Sepulchre in August of 1948, where the family could go visit him and honor his sacrifice properly. My sons finally sold the grocery store in 1959, and it had been in the family for 35 years. Peter and Lucy sold the Cottage Hotel in 1961, and it had been in the village for almost 80 years at that point, offering travelers and locals alike fine food and lodging. Here's an ad advertising the dining room, and the specialty is, of course, pasta in good Italian fashion. The cottage hotel operated for 7 years after my son sold it, but it had a devastating fire in 1968. It took 6 fire companies and 125 firefighters to put the blaze out. Hawk DeRizio, who you will also hear about later, opened his restaurant across the street to serve the firefighters and the displaced hotel guests, and it was also the first aid station. There were several injuries and sadly 1 casualty in the fire. The building was unable to be saved, and it was razed the following year, as you can see from this picture. It was another sad loss of a grand old building in our village. My husband Tony retired in the late 1930s. Our daughter Fanny and her husband Frank lived with us and took good care of us in our old age, just as dutiful children should. Anthony died just after our 58th wedding anniversary in 1947. We had many wonderful years together, spanning 2 countries and the Atlantic Ocean. I died in 1950 at the age of 81. By then I had 12 grandchildren and 6 great-grandchildren. 2 of my granddaughters were named for me, in good Italian fashion, and several grandsons were named for Anthony as well. And you can never have too many Tonys in an Italian family. When I died in 1950, our estate was valued at $76,000, which is the equivalent of about $750,000 in today's money. Not bad for immigrant grocers who didn't speak much English and only had a 4th grade education. Truly, I can say the Princivalis lived the American dream.
Want a sweater? Or something like that. When you think about Italian immigrants to Fairport in the early 1900s, my family is probably as stereotypical as you can get. My husband, Tony Messerino, and I, Antoinette Guarino Messerino, were married in Italy in 1910, and we moved to America just a few years later. Our oldest son, Nick, was born in Italy, but our other 5 children were born right here in Fairport. We settled on the north side of the village, and my husband Tony worked at the can factory for over 30 years. Our children went to school here and were as American as you can get. Nick, Tony, and I became U.S. citizens as soon as we could. We embraced our new home, settling in the Italian part of town, living on State Street, next to families like the Princivalis. My mother and several of my brothers immigrated as well, so that made the transition to America much easier. We went to church at the Assumption of Our Lady, and our lives really revolved around the village. We shopped, worked, worshiped, and socialized here, and mostly with other Italian immigrant families, often through the San Sebastian Society. Tony was a charter member of that organization, along with Antonio Carlamusto and several other members of the community, and we were very involved in the organization, as were our children. The can company was the major employer in the village, and most people we knew worked here. The company started in 1904 on Parse Avenue as a sanitary can company in an old shoe factory. American Can absorbed Sanitary Can in 1908, and after that, it was often referred to as Canco. When we moved to Fairport, it employed about 250 people, and Tony got a job there right away. It was hard labor, long hours, but you could support a family on those wages, so we were happy. We had a very comfortable life living here, raising our children, and by 1930, we owned our own home. Several of our children worked at the can factory as they got older. During World War I, the company produced millions of cans for the American Expeditionary Forces in Europe. By World War II, the company was again asked to aid the war effort, but this time rather than just providing cans for food, they were asked to make containers for explosives, signal flares, first aid kits, ammunition, and blood plasma. In fact, the can company was credited with solving the problem of safely transporting plasma to the front lines. In 1943 alone, the company produced over 4 million plasma cans to help our boys overseas. And I mean that both figuratively and literally. Our son William had to leave his wife and baby to go fight in Europe. He was wounded in France, received a rifle bullet in his arm, for which he received a Purple Heart. Our son Frank also served our country in the Merchant Marines. And both boys came home to me, thank God. It was comforting to know that our community's work here at the American Can Company was saving the lives of people we knew and loved over there. And that Tony was working at a company that was so critical to the war effort. All these government contracts that the company got during the war meant lots of overtime, lots of long hours. And as in any manufacturing job, there are risks involved. And during the height of the war in 1944, Tony was severely injured on the job. He spent several weeks in the hospital, never fully recovered, and had to retire. I feel like our family, like so many others, answered our country's call with everything we had. After the war, America was booming, and Fairport was no exception. The can company, housing, everything exploded. Our son Nick, who had been working in a grocery store since he left school, opened his own market at 117 North Main Street on the corner of Main Street on the corner of Parse Avenue. Now the Fairport Vet Hospital is at that place. Of course, it was near the can company. Nick sold meat, vegetables, and groceries, and he was an excellent butcher. People knew they could count on him to cut up their meat just the way they wanted it. He and other markets provided wonderful service to their customers, and Nick did special things, like having Santa stop by in December to hand out candy, fruit, and nuts to children who came into the store. Some years, 500 kids came. Those were busy years. These were the days, but none of you remember this, when people ran a credit account at the store. And neighborhood kids, like the Dorizio boys, would stop into Nick's and charge dimes on their parents' accounts to play pinball. Nick would wink and go along with it. The kids loved him. My Nick was so generous with his time, his money, and his talent, and he gave back to the community in so many ways. He was a member of the San Sebastian Society, the Lions Club, the fire department, our beloved church, and many other organizations. He helped plan blood drives, community fund drives, and Halloween festivities. He also helped with more serious issues, like helping the village study parking issues and study what to do about the lift bridge and the railroad crossing grade, which the village had struggled with for years. And you know, if you drive into the village today and you have to wait for a bridge and a train, you know that they're still struggling. But if there was something to do in town, Nick was there. My other children were active in neighboring communities as well. For instance, our son Frank managed Panorama Lane's bowling alley in Penfield for many years. And my daughter Margaret's husband, Sam Chiodo, was a policeman in East Rochester. Our family was very involved in the community. But times change, and the smaller family markets began to go the way of the horse and buggy. Nick opened up a bigger market on South Main Street in the 1970s, supermarket. And he hoped to stay in business against the bigger guys. He managed to hang in there for many years by providing exceptional service, great food, and cutting meat just the way people wanted it. Some of you might even remember my Nick with his warm smile, his friendly greeting for each customer. Some of you may have even gotten a dime for a pinball machine. Come on, fess up. Any one of you? No? Or candy from Santa in his store, but only if you were good. Grazie.
Here? Here?
I'm trying to give a good impersonation of her. When you hear the name Kennelly in this town, what does it bring to mind? A former mayor and the gazebo park by the library that's named for him. That was my grandson, Vincent G. Kennelly. I'm Catherine Kennelly, née Hickey, and I'm going to tell you about some of the many ways my family served this community in addition to my grandson being mayor of the village. My husband, Timothy, was born in Limerick, Ireland, and came to this country at the age of 4 in 1855, the year I was born. I was a Fairport girl, born and raised. After Timothy and I married in 1875, we raised 10 children here. I was very busy, I can tell you. When we were first married, Timothy worked for the railroad as a brakeman and then later as a fireman. It required a lot of travel and time away, so raising the children fell mostly to me. He loved the railroad and the travel it entailed. There was something magical about trains. He loved the speed, the movement, the scenery going by, the excitement of it. There was nothing else in the world like it, and he did that for over 30 years. While Timothy worked for the railroad, we bought a building in the mid-1890s on North Main Street, where the Village Inn is today. There was a saloon there for many years, which someone else ran, as well as other businesses and a fire station. That building was known as the Kennelly Block well into the 1940s. Speaking of a fire station, you've heard from several of my neighbors tonight about some of the fires in the village over the years. The DeLand Company started the fire department here in 1877, and I'm proud to say that 3 generations of my family served in the fire department. My son Vincent, my grandson Vincent, and his son Timothy all were members of the Hook and Ladder Company. Fighting fires was dangerous work, but necessary for the safety of our homes and businesses. Even today, we are protected by loyal, brave, volunteer firefighters, all of whom are somebody's husbands or wives, sons or daughters, neighbors and friends. We owe a great deal to the bravery and service of these men and women. But let me get back to my story. By 1910, Timothy had retired from the railroad, and we bought a farm on Tilloo Road, now High Street Extension. Our children helped on the farm when they weren't in school, but as they grew up and left school, most of them didn't want to be farmers. They went into other businesses. Our sons John and Vincent followed in their father's footsteps and went to work for the railroad. 3 of our boys, James, Timothy Jr., and Leo, all worked for Shinola Shoe Polish Company in the late teens and early 20s. Shinola was located in Rochester, but was run by Fairport's own Adam Craig Jr. of Craig Road. Rochester Shinola was once one of America's most recognizable brands. In 1909, the company made 50,000 boxes of shoe polish every single day. My boys were traveling salesmen for this famous company, working all over the United States.
My son James visited all 48 states while working for them. I guess they inherited the need for travel and movement from my husband, for none of them could stay put anywhere for long. They all loved traveling the country, though they'd come home every few months for a bit to rest up and visit. Then it was back on the road again. Mind you, I like to think that my family had the cleanest, brightest, shiniest shoes in the whole of Fairport. As I mentioned, my son Vincent worked for the railroad like his father. In the 1920s, he was a conductor on the trolley. It was called the on-time line for its punctuality, thanks to my husband, my son. It ran through Perinton right through the village, crossing the canal just east of town. Where it ran next to the canal, they had to put up fences so the trains wouldn't spook the mules that were pulling the boats. The trolley line opened in 1906 and operated until 1931. It made travel between the city and the suburbs clean, efficient, and easy. After the trolley closed, Vincent worked for the village for the Department of Public Works. His wife Edna worked for the Fairport Herald Mail newspaper, writing the social news. At the time of the trolley's demise, I was in my late 70s, and I had been in ill health for several years. I died in August of 1934, after almost 60 years of marriage. At the time of my death, I was the third oldest member of the Church of the Assumption's congregation. I had been very active in the church, which has seen many changes and renovations during my lifetime. In fact, the church started during my lifetime. I was 10 when the congregation was first formed in 1866. Before that, we were a mission of St. Anne's Parish in Palmyra. In all the years from 1866 until 1934, we only had 4 priests, and the majority of that time we were served by Father Cordryer, an old-style priest from Ireland. He was very firm with us and held us to account. But he cared for us, and we all loved him dearly. When the parish began, it was very small, but expanded rapidly with the influx of Irish and later Italian immigrants. During the Civil War, we had to double the size of our church to accommodate our members. In 1872, we dedicated St. Mary's Cemetery, where all of us speaking to you tonight are buried. We built an entirely new church in 1878, which was followed by many expansions and renovations. In 1925, the church got a new heating system, a new pipe organ, and began celebrating midnight mass on Christmas Eve. Change can be hard, but sometimes it's good, because I certainly enjoyed the new organ and better heating. Timothy died 3 years after me in 1937. He was a patriot to the end, making his way to the polls on election day right up until he died. Our family was not short of patriots. Our grandson Vincent's son, joined the Army as soon as he graduated from Fairport High School in 1942. He did his basic training at Fort Knox, Kentucky, and attended gunnery school, where he learned to be a tank gunner. He was assigned to 749th Armored Battalion. The 749th was one of the first to hit Omaha Beach on D-Day. My grandson always credited their driver that day, saying it was his driving that kept them alive. Vincent was awarded a Bronze Star for his heroic action against the enemy during his time overseas. The 749th Tank Battalion, whose motto is Fear Our Rage, holds 3 Pentagon records: most consecutive days in combat, most miles traveled through Europe, and most units served. Upon his return from the war, Vincent helped found the local VFW chapter. He served as post commander in 1949. After the war, he worked for the railroad in East Rochester and married his wife, Noreen. He worked for the railroad until 1970, when he fell off his roof and was injured, which forced him to leave the railroad for good. he and Noreen opened an auction house, which he had always wanted to do. Auctioneering was his passion. Vincent also served the village for over 30 years, both on the Board of Trustees and in the 1980s as mayor. He thoroughly enjoyed serving the people of this village, where he had lived for his whole life. After his death, they named the gazebo park after him, which seems fitting, as it's right in the heart of this village, which he loves so much. Like so many families in Fairport, we have descendants still living here today. This is the kind of place you never want to leave. I'm glad I'm buried here in town, and when the wind blows just right, I can even hear the bells from my beloved church ringing, keeping us company up on the hill in St. Mary's. Oh, sorry.
Mrs. Canale.
Yes.
Mrs. Canale.
Yes. Oh,
I want you to know that we have something in common.
Oh, yes?
My son, Salvatore, was in the high school class of 1942, and this is the yearbook that has his picture in it. Now I have something I want you to do. I want you to read to me what that says on the title page.
Oh, I'm going to cry.
Can you share it with us?
Vincent G. Canale, class of 1943.
Would you like to see a picture of him because you died in 1934?
Such a handsome boy.
And folks, this was not a plant.
Purely ad lib.
You need to know this because God moves us crazy way. I got here too late, and I went upstairs, and I knew that Salvatore, son of my graduated in 1942. So I ran up to the hourglass things. And found the class of 1942. Pulled it down, came down at 7 o'clock, and here it was. And so that's what I used. So I'm sitting there, and I'm looking through this, and it says Vincent G. Canale. This was Vinnie Canale's hourglass. It was not a plant. So come to the museum and see all the great stuff.
All right. I'm sorry, I just got off of work, you know. During the war here, it's been really rough, so I couldn't quite get prepared correctly here. So, anyways, well, I'm going to ask you, can you imagine sending 6 of your loved ones off to war? That's what my family did. Yep. 6 of my brothers, Marco, Albert, Charles, Anthony, Floyd, and John. They left us in the early 1940s to serve overseas. Father has even received a letter from Congressman Joseph J. O'Brien commending our family's contribution to the war efforts. I think I might, yeah, I do. I knew you wouldn't get away with that. Here it is. May I grasp this opportunity to salute you as an outstanding American citizen whose patriotism and the patriotism of your family is worthy of national recognition. Any father and mother who have 6 sons serving in the service, proves in a very conclusive way, by the way, that the ideals and the traditions of our great country will never be jeopardized by those who do not fully appreciate the privilege of living in the great republic. Oh, words of inspiration. Father and my 2 sisters and I are very proud of my brothers. But that's not to say that we didn't worry now. You have to understand, these are rough times. What were the chances of these 6 family members all coming home from war? Luckily for us, the DeRizios, all of them, returned home safely. Oh, by the way, I'm Virginia DeRizio. I'm the 7th of 10 DeRizio children. Mama and Papa, they were busy. Anyways, our family had its hardships. My mother died in 1925 when John was born. So I pretty much was raised by my big sister, Sarah. She was the oldest sibling. My father, like many others, Joseph, worked at the Certo factory. My brothers, they all worked hard too. They had to help support the family. Matthew, he worked on the railroad car shops, in East Rochester. Marco, he worked on the railroad. Albert and Charles, well, they're in the restaurant business. My 3 younger brothers, though, were in school. When the war came, we expected the worst, especially with so many of my brothers going off to war. Albert, I'm not sure if this is correct or not, if I say had the distinction, the honor, of being the first serviceman drafted by the local Selective Service Board. But he was also the first draftee to be given a discharge. So that worked out pretty well for him. Actually, things always seem to work out for Albert. My father used to say, he could talk the hind legs off a donkey. Now, Al would write the funniest letters home, and Dad would share them with the Fairport Herald-Mail. Now, see, Al, he's a mess sergeant in the Army. His favorite saying was, and those of you that have been in the service probably think this of the cooks, when it turns black, it's cooked. It's a good thing he had such a great sense of humor because he participated not in 1, but in 3 D-Day invasions. Now, not the one everyone thinks of, June 6, 1944. His division, the 9th Division, was supposed to participate on that day. But they couldn't land due to the very severe weather conditions. Instead, his 3rd invasion was on June 10th when they hit the shores of Utah Beach. He told us about one time how he had set up his field kitchen in Italy, basking in the lovely sun. The beautiful, beautiful Italian day when the Germans had they set up a motor barrage. Al was furious. He said it wrecked a perfectly good day. To make matters worse, the shell burst overhead. Shrapnel pierced his very best kitchen pot. He said he was too mad to be scared, thinking that how difficult it's going to be to get a replacement for that pot. So many years after the war, he told us how he had these visions of us 3 lovely sisters at home, and even the family cat, crossing the little bridge over Thomas Creek. He thought about what we would say if we learned that he had been killed somewhere overseas. Al decided then and there he was coming home to us, and he did along with all the brothers. We are one fortunate family. I'm sorry, all this time I've been talking about Albert, but I didn't realize most of you probably know him by his nickname. Okay, now my brother Al, here in Fairport, everybody says it was because Al had this kind of nose that looked like a hawk. I was talking to some of his buddies in the war. There's no, it's not that. He had great eyesight. He could see far, far away. Every pretty girl he saw far, far away. I just called him Al, my big brother. If you knew Al, you knew he had many passions. Al was a member of the Verdi Opera Society of Rochester. Anyways, a charter member of the Fairport Lions Club, and he owned, what? Hawk's Restaurant on North Main Street. You know, he opened that very soon after he got back from the war. I guess cooking in the Army sure came in handy for that restaurant business. Now, at the risk of showing a lack of humility, I've got to say that Hawk was a legend. Everyone knew him. Everyone wanted to talk to him, and he wanted to talk to everyone. And everyone loved him, and I'm very, very proud to be his sister. My father, Joseph, though, now, this is a legend too, but in a very different way. Father made at least a dozen barrels of adult cider every year. He always had a smaller one, a barrel of sweet cider for us children. Father's big boss at the Certo Company plant would be invited over to partake of the adult cider. The boss would come in driving his fancy Pierce car over the, Thomas Creek Bridge, coming to our house at 33 Water Street. He never seemed to have a problem getting to the house. He did have a little, maybe too much to imbibe, and then the bridge seemed to narrow for him on his way going home. Yeah. Our house was also known by most of the ladies in the village as the Trap. Because any man that came walking by would be invited to test out that good cider. Hours later, when they meandered up out of the cellar, we could hear their wives calling. Some of them were still on our front porch. Let me tell you, I can't repeat some of the things that happened, but it got pretty darn interesting. So as you can imagine, with that many children, the 10 of us, we had a large, large family that went forth and multiplied. And we have expanded many, many generations. We're also extremely proud Italian people to call Fairport our home. Thank you.
Hi. Let me see if I can get this on. Thank you. Hi, how are y'all doing today? Glad to see you, especially the two gentlemen in the back there. You, madame, there. You take a size 6 shoe. Oh, I'm sorry, the Broncos. Hey! Thank you, Charlie. This is really an honor. What the heck? Let me start over again. It won't be too. Let's do this right. Hi, how are you all? How are you doing today? Glad to see you. You, madame, you there, you take a size 6 shoe. Yes, I thought so. You see, I know all about shoes because I own a shoe store. Perhaps you visited my fine establishment at 32 North Main Street. It's called Bronco, and I am James Bronco. Pleased to meet all of you. I've been invited to tell you a little bit about my life, so here goes. You may not realize it, but I'm not a native of Fairport. I grew up in Italy. We had 10 kids in my family. Seems like that was a nice kind. Sorry. It wasn't a bad life, but some of us wanted to see America. My brother Angelo and I, we came from Italy together in 1912 on a ship called the Martha Washington. What a great way to come to America, on a ship named after George Washington's wife, right? We had another brother, Joe, who came 6 months later. 3 of the Bronco brothers were together again. Angelo and Joe were in the shoe business too. So we came to Fairport and set up a little cobbler shop at 45 West Avenue. That's not West, is it? That's the current one. Anyway, later, Joe worked at the Sertal plant, but Angelo and I stayed in the shoe business. We stayed close to each other. Many years we were living in the same house with our families. My wife, Josephine, and I had 2 children, Charlie and Angeline. Angelo and his wife, Michelina, had 4 children. 2 of them were called Charles and Angelina. And believe it or not, our brother Joe had 3 children, which also included a Charles and Angelina. Yeah, it could get a little crazy around our houses when the families were together. Everyone was Charlie or Angelina. The store moved here and there on the north side, but we ended up at 32 North Main Street. In fact, the business is still there more than 100 years later after Angelo and I started it. Now my son Charlie runs it. He's added clothing to the store in addition to selling shoes. Great picture. I'm very proud of my son for keeping the family business alive. There were lots of Italians there on the north side of the tracks. Lots of families you've heard from tonight, and many more you didn't. Hey, Mrs. Galante! How are ya? When my son Charlie got married in '61, Mrs. Galante's son Mike was the best man. See, the Italian community was really close. Everyone knew everyone. Lots of people came from the same towns in Italy. It was nice to come to Fairport and speak Italian and talk with our neighbors about the good old days in Italy. But we were all very honored to be in America and proud to learn the customs of our new country. Now, when I think of life I've led and the adventures I've had, Italy is remembered fondly, but it's my days in Fairport that make me look back and say, those were the good old days. Thanks for listening. Stop by and store sometime. I got a pair of 6 in blue pumps.
Push it to the next one. Before I introduce our actors from this evening, I wanted a show of hands. How many of you are members of the families that were represented? I know the Barancos are here, the Biancuccis, the Carlamustos. Who else have we got? Streppa and Mara, wonderful. These are just some of the Italian families that have been in Fairport through the years. Are any of you members of any of these families that we didn't speak of tonight? Which family? Bartolotta's, wonderful. And Militellos as well, wonderful. I would encourage all of you that came from these immigrant families. The Fairport Museum has been here for 38 years in this building, but the Perinton Historical Society has been around since 1935. And we noticed a lot of information missing when it came to our immigrant families. When we tried to work on our house tour last year, there wasn't a lot of information about the Bartolottas and the Barancos and the Carlamustos, and we need to fix that. So what I'm asking for all of you who come from these families, we would love to make copies of your passports and your photographs and any information that you would like to share with us so we can ensure that these Italian and Irish immigrant families are able to share their history through the years. We would really love to get that information. We have, I don't have one up here, but yes, there are many, many Irish over there as well. And it's the same thing for the Irish, where we go to check and look for information, and we don't have it. So that would be a really wonderful thing for us to be able to gather that information. We'd happily scan your photos and give you all the originals back, but it's so important for us to have this information to save for the future. Uh-oh. This was compiled from a list of 1980 newspaper article, in addition to headstones, other research that we've done. Whenever we came across a family, we would add it to the list. So this is what we came up with, some of which is probably misspelled and or Americanized. I would like to take the opportunity to call our actors up so you can find out who portrayed these wonderful people who lived in our neighborhood. So if you would all come up and stand up here, please. Suzanne Lee as Thelma Principali, Suzanne Lee. Wes Harris as William Carey. Marianne Cady as Madalena Carlamusto. Ann Johnston as Catherine Hickey Kennelly. Dave Shire as James Barranco. Sue Shire as Virginia DeRizio. Lucy McCormick as Antoinette Guarino Messerino. And of course, our own famous Doug Whitney as Benedetto Ann Sweeney. And I would like to say the character that I portrayed tonight was Antonia Marinelli Galante. Much of the script that you heard was written by her daughter Maria Romano, who wasn't able to stay this evening. She has written a wonderful memoir about growing up in Italy and coming to the United States, and the differences, and yet all of the things that were the same, the families that they came and they spent time with here, and meeting wonderful neighbors. It was really an amazing thing to be able to read this memoir, and Maria Galante Romano has, we've printed it up, and we do have a copy at the museum, so that will be shared with future generations. So thank you so much for coming this evening. We're so happy to share these stories.
Ladies and gentlemen, just before you leave, this couldn't happen without Vicki Prophet and Suzanne.
Thank you. I'm glad I found that here.
I'm glad you did too.
Nice stitch.